She had only one blanket, one candle, and barely enough bread for the morning. But when a tired stranger and his young daughter knocked on her door that stormy night, she opened it anyway. What she didn't know was that this single act of kindness would change her life forever, and reveal a truth so powerful it would test her heart, her courage, and her understanding of what real wealth truly means. Stay with this story until the end, because the poorest girl in town was about to teach a millionaire cowboy the most expensive lesson of his life. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin wooden walls of Alara's tiny shack. Rain lashed against the single window, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass. Inside, the world was small and dim, lit by a single, sputtering candle. Alara pulled her only blanket tighter around her shoulders, the wool thin and worn. On the rickety table sat her entire fortune, half a loaf of stale bread and a small piece of cheese. It was barely enough for her own breakfast, but it was all she had. Suddenly a loud, desperate knock echoed through the tiny room. Alara froze. No one ever came to her door, especially not in a storm like this. She lived on the very edge of town, in a place most people prefer to forget. Hesitantly, she moved to the door, her heart pounding. Another knock, this time more urgent. She took a deep breath and pulled the door open just a crack. A man stood on her doorstep, drenched and shivering. He was tall, with broad shoulders, but his face was etched with exhaustion. Water dripped from the brim of his wide cowboy hat. Huddled behind his legs, clutching his coat, was a little girl, no older than 7. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her tiny body trembled from the cold. "Please." The man's voice was rough but polite. "Our wagon broke down a mile back. We're freezing. Is there any chance we could just get out of the storm for a bit? Just until it passes." He looked from Alara to his daughter, his expression a mix of desperation and hope. Alara's mind raced. Her shack was barely big enough for one person. She had no extra food, no extra blankets. Turning them away was the logical thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But then she looked at the little girl, her face pale and her lips blue. She saw her own childhood reflection in those frightened eyes, a time when she too had been cold, hungry, and alone. In that moment, her own poverty didn't matter. Her own hunger felt insignificant. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Come in and get warm." The man's shoulders slumped in relief. "Thank you," he breathed, guiding his daughter inside. "Thank you so much." He introduced himself as Jed, and his daughter as Lily. As they stepped into the dim light, Alara saw they were dressed in fine, though now soaking wet clothes. Strange for people whose wagon had broken down on this forgotten road. Alara didn't ask questions. She took her one and only blanket and wrapped it around the shivering little girl. Lily looked up at her with wide, grateful eyes and whispered a tiny "thank you." Alara's heart ached. She then gestured for Jed to sit by the small, struggling fire in her hearth, the only source of heat. She added her last few pieces of wood, knowing she'd have none for the morning. "It's not much," Alara said, breaking her half loaf of bread and her small piece of cheese into 3 portions. She handed the largest share to Lily, the next to Jed, and kept the smallest crumb for herself. Jed looked at the meager offering, then at Alara. He saw the bare cupboards, the threadbare blanket she had just given his daughter, the emptiness of the room. He knew this was likely all she had. "We can't take your food," he said, trying to hand it back. Alara gently pushed his hand away. "Nonsense," she insisted. "A guest in my home doesn't go hungry. It's a hard night. We all need our strength." They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. Lily, wrapped in the warm blanket and with food in her belly, soon fell asleep in her father's arms. Jed watched Alara, his gaze intense. He had been all over the country, met all kinds of people, from the richest oil barons to the toughest ranch hands, but he'd never met anyone like her. She had nothing, yet she had given them everything. The storm raged on for hours. To pass the time, Alara told Jed about her life in the small town. She spoke of the little joys she found, the beauty of a sunrise, the kindness of the baker who sometimes gave her day-old bread, the stray cat she shared her scraps with. She never once complained about her poverty. Her spirit was rich, filled with a quiet resilience and a profound sense of gratitude for the little she did have. Jed in turn found himself opening up to her. He spoke of his life as a wealthy rancher from another state, of the pressures of his business, of his wife who had passed away 2 years prior. He confessed that he was on this journey to try and reconnect with his daughter Lily, who had grown quiet and distant since her mother's death. He had been trying to buy her happiness with expensive gifts and fancy trips, but it wasn't working. He felt like he was failing her. "She doesn't need more things," Alara said softly, looking at the sleeping child. "She just needs you, your time, your heart. That's a gift no amount of money can buy." Her simple words struck Jed like a bolt of lightning. He had been so focused on providing for Lily financially that he had forgotten to provide for her emotionally. He looked at Ilara, this woman who owned nothing but was richer in spirit than anyone he'd ever met. She understood a truth that had completely escaped him. As dawn broke, the storm finally subsided. The world outside was washed clean and the morning sun cast a golden glow. Jed knew it was time to leave. He gently woke Lily, who smiled at Ilara, a real, genuine smile that Jed hadn't seen in months. As they stood at the door, Jed reached into his coat. He pulled out a thick wallet, overflowing with cash. "I can never repay you for your kindness," he said, trying to hand her a stack of bills. "But please, let me give you this." "It's the least I can do." Ilara looked at the money, more than she had ever seen in her life. She could buy a new home, new clothes, food for a year. It would solve all her problems. But she slowly shook her head, a gentle smile on her face. "You don't owe me anything, Jed," she said. "Kindness isn't a transaction. I gave you what I had because it was the right thing to do. Your thanks and seeing that little girl's smile, that's all the payment I need." Jed was stunned into silence. He had spent his life believing that money was the ultimate power, the solution to every problem. And here, in the poorest shack he had ever seen, he was being taught the most profound lesson of his life. Ilara's wealth wasn't in her pocket. It was in her heart. He put the money away, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me something far more valuable than money. You've given me clarity." He knelt down and hugged Lily. "We're going to do things differently from now on, sweetheart," he whispered to her. He promised Ilara he would be back, and he kept his word. A week later, Jed returned, but he didn't come with money. He came with a team of builders. He explained that his wagon hadn't broken down by accident. He had been looking to invest in the area and had gotten lost in the storm. Finding her was, as he put it, the luckiest mistake of my life. He told her he was building a new community center for the town, a place with a soup kitchen, a shelter for those in need, and a school for the children, and he wanted her to run it. "No one," he said, "knows the value of compassion better than you. Ilara, you can teach this whole town what you taught me." Ilara, with tears in her eyes, accepted. The little shack on the edge of town was replaced by a sturdy, warm home, but more importantly, Ilara's life was filled with purpose. She dedicated herself to helping others, spreading the same kindness that she had once shown to a stranger in a storm. Jed became a regular visitor, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a friend. He and Lily would spend weekends helping at the center, learning from Ilara's example. Lily blossomed, her laughter echoing through the halls of the center, her bond with her father stronger than ever. The story of the poor girl and the millionaire cowboy became a local legend. It was a reminder that true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. Ilara, who once had only a single blanket, ended up warming the hearts of an entire community. And Jed, a man who thought he could buy anything, discovered that the most valuable things in life, kindness, connection, and love, are priceless, and they are given, not bought. The rain fell like it had a grudge against the earth, heavy and relentless, turning the dirt road into thick, unforgiving mud. Inside a small, broken wooden house at the very edge of town, Lily sat beside a single, flickering candle. Her fingers, nimble and cold, were stitching a tear in her only winter coat. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, a mournful sound that carried the chill straight to her bones. Hunger was a quiet, familiar ache in her stomach, but she had learned long ago how to push it aside, how to ignore its constant, gnawing presence. Lily had been poor for as long as she could remember. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic poverty, but the kind that settles into your life like dust, slow, silent, and just everywhere. Since her mother passed away 2 years ago, the world had shrunk into a place where survival was the only goal, pushing dreams far out of reach. Her days were spent washing clothes for the townsfolk, people who paid her a few coins but barely looked her in the eye. At night, she would return to this tiny house with its sagging roof and floorboards that groaned with every step, as if tired of holding up the weight of her loneliness. That evening, as the storm raged, she was preparing to sleep early. Sleep was an escape, a temporary reprieve from the cold and the hunger. But then, a sound cut through the noise of the wind and rain. A knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side was unsure they even had the right to ask for help. Lily froze. Visitors were not just rare. They were non-existent. No one ever came to her door. What could she possibly offer? The knock came again, a little louder this time, more certain. Her heart began to race. In a town where people judged you by the shine of your boots and the weight of your purse, a knock in the middle of a stormy night could only mean trouble. Wrapping her patched coat tighter around her small frame, she crept toward the door. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the simple wooden latch. She took a deep breath and pulled it open. The sight that greeted her was not what she expected. A tall man stood in the downpour, his wide-brimmed cowboy hat soaked and dripping onto the muddy ground. His coat was worn and dusty, and his boots were caked in mud. Beside him, clutching his hand for dear life, stood a little girl, no older than 7. Her hair was damp and plastered to her face. Her dress was thin and offered little protection from the cold, and her eyes. Those eyes. They held a mixture of fear and utter exhaustion that struck Lily right in the chest. It was a look she knew all too well. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice low and respectful, but tired. "Every inn in town turned us away. We just need a place to stay for one night. I can work for it. I'll fix anything that's broken around here. I swear." The little girl tightened her grip on his hand and looked up at Lily, her small lips trembling from the cold. And that one look, that single, silent plea from a child, erased all of Lily's fear. Lily knew what it felt like to be turned away, to be made to feel invisible. She glanced behind her at the small, sparse room, the single bed, the empty shelf where food should have been. Every rational thought, every instinct for self-preservation screamed no. She had barely enough space for herself, barely enough warmth, barely enough hope to get through the night. But her heart spoke louder than her fear. "You can come in," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the storm. "It's not much, but it's dry." The man's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was as if he'd been carrying the weight of the entire world. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to us." As they stepped inside, out of the wind and rain, Lily quickly shut the door, sealing them in a small pocket of fragile safety. The little girl immediately knelt by the candle on the floor, her small hands reaching for its tiny flame, trying to chase away the bone-deep chill. The man removed his hat, a gesture of respect in her humble home. "I'm Jack," he said. "And this is my daughter, Emma." "I'm Lily," she replied. Without a second thought, she took the old blanket from her bed and offered it to them. They protested, saying she needed it more, but she insisted. She then went to her small cupboard and took out the last of her bread. She broke it into 3 pieces, making sure Emma's was the largest. The child ate slowly, cautiously, as if she was afraid the food might vanish if she looked away. That night, Lily gave them her bed and lay on the hard, cold floor, covered only by her thin coat. The wind howled outside like a hungry wolf, but for the first time in a very long time, there was a strange warmth inside the little house. It wasn't the heat from a fire. It was the warmth of purpose, of connection. What Lily didn't know as she drifted into an uneasy sleep was that the tired traveler sleeping in her bed was no ordinary drifter. She didn't know that he owned miles of rich ranch land just beyond the hills, or that he was one of the wealthiest cattle owners in the entire state. He had come to town in disguise, testing the hearts of its people, searching for something more valuable than money. And she certainly didn't know that this single night, this one quiet, selfless choice to open her door, was about to change her life forever. But morning was still hours away. And before the sun would rise, Lily would face a challenge that would test the very limits of her kindness. An unexpected turn of events would put her in a difficult position, forcing her to make a choice that could cost her everything. The true character of the townsfolk, and of her mysterious guests, was about to be revealed in a way no one could have predicted. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break. And Lily was standing right in the middle of it. The morning arrived quietly, as if it wasn't sure it was welcome. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. Pale sunlight slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls, landing gently on Lily's face as she stirred awake on the floor. For just a moment she forgot everything, the hunger, the loneliness, the endless struggle. Then, a soft laugh broke the silence. Emma, the little girl, sat on the edge of the bed, swinging her feet, her hair still a messy halo from sleep. She looked healthier already, as if warmth and safety had breathed new life back into her overnight. "You sleep on the floor?" Emma asked with wide, innocent eyes. Lily managed to smile. "I'm used to it." Jack was already awake, standing near the broken window, studying the small room with thoughtful eyes. There was something different about him now, more alert, more observant. This wasn't the look of a man defeated by the road, but one who was quietly measuring things. "You shouldn't have given us the bed," he said gently. "Especially when you have so little," Lily just shrugged. "It's just for one night. Sometimes people need rest more than comfort." Jack didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, as if storing her words somewhere deep inside himself, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Lily moved to the small shelf and began preparing the only breakfast she could offer: hot water with a tiny pinch of dried herbs. It wasn't much, but it was all she had, a gesture of care in a world that offered her little. Emma watched her closely, her eyes following every single movement. "My mama used to make tea like that," Emma said softly, her voice small. Before she went to heaven, Lily paused, her heart aching for the child. She didn't ask questions. Pain recognized pain without needing explanations. She just offered a quiet, understanding look. But before they could even sit down, a sharp voice cut through the fragile peace. "Well, would you look at this?" Lily's heart dropped. She turned to see Mr. Harlan, the town's most respected landowner, or at least the one people pretended to respect, standing just outside the open door. Behind him were two men, their faces masks of judgment. "I wondered why strangers were snooping around my land," Harlan said coldly, his eyes locking onto Jack. "And now I find them in your house." "This isn't your land," Lily said, forcing a calm she didn't feel into her voice. "This house is barely standing," Harlan interrupted with a sneer. "And you're behind on rent?" Jack stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Harlan and the women. "Sir, we meant no trouble. We stayed one night because of the storm. We'll leave immediately." Harlan let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you will. But not before I make sure this girl understands something." He turned his cruel gaze back to Lily. "Helping strangers brings trouble. You should learn your place." At that moment, Emma's small hand slipped into Lily's. Something inside Lily hardened, not with anger, but with a sudden, unshakable dignity. "She's just a child," Lily said firmly, her voice steady. "And they needed help," Harlan sneered. "And what will kindness get you, girl? Another empty night? Another hungry stomach?" Jack watched all of this quietly, his eyes growing darker with every word Harlan spoke. "I'll work," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "I told you. I'll pay whatever she owes." Harlan looked him up and down with open disgust. "You? You don't even look like you own a clean shirt." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Jack's lips. "Appearances can be deceiving," Harlan scoffed, dismissing them entirely. "Be gone by noon. All of you." He turned and left, his men following like shadows. Lily closed the door slowly, her hands shaking. Emma clung to her leg, her small body trembling. "I'm sorry," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to cause you more trouble." Jack turned to her, his expression serious, his voice steady. "You didn't. Some people just hate being reminded of what they're not." They packed quietly, the small shack feeling even smaller now. Lily insisted on walking them to the road, a final act of hospitality she felt she owed them. When they reached the edge of town where the dirt path met the wider road, Jack stopped. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, his gaze meeting hers directly. "But I will. I promise you that." Lily shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. It was the right thing to do." Suddenly, Emma let go of her father's hand and launched herself at Lily, hugging her tightly around the legs. "I hope you get everything you dream of," the little girl whispered. Lily knelt, hugging her back, tears welling in her eyes. "I hope you always find kind doors," she whispered back. They parted ways. Lily watched them walk away until they were just specks on the horizon. What she didn't see was that once Jack reached the top of the hill, he stopped and turned back, standing still as the entire town spread out below him. His face was no longer that of a tired traveler. It was calm, resolved, and undeniably powerful. 3 days later, the town changed. First, fancy carriages arrived, stirring up dust and whispers. Then, papers were signed in the town hall, passed between men in suits. Land, it was rumored, was changing hands. And Mr. Harlan stood in the middle of the town square, pale and speechless, as the truth was finally revealed. Jack wasn't just a drifter, a cowboy down on his luck. He was Jonathan Blackwood, owner of the largest cattle ranch across 3 counties, a man whose wealth could rebuild the entire town 10 times over if he wished. He had been traveling incognito, trying to reconnect with a world he felt he had lost touch with. And his very first decision? To buy every single inch of land Lily had ever feared losing. That afternoon, Lily stood frozen on her porch as Jack returned. He was dressed simply, but there was a new air about him. He walked up to her and handed her a set of legal papers, not with pride or arrogance, but with the deepest respect. "This house is yours now," he said, his voice soft. "No rent, no fear." Lily's voice broke, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Why? Why would you do this?" Jack looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Because when I had everything, I forgot what mattered, and when you had nothing, you gave anyway. You reminded me." Tears streamed down Lily's face then, not tears of relief, but tears of being truly seen for the first time in her life. He didn't just throw money at her problems. He helped her open a small laundry business, giving her a purpose and a path. He made sure she had the tools to learn, to grow, to choose her own future. Emma visited often, running into Lily's arms and calling her family. And through it all, Lily learned the most profound lesson of her life. Wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you're willing to give when no one is watching. The poorest girl in town didn't just become rich that day, she became powerful. Because kindness, when given freely and without expectation, always finds its way back to you multiplied. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. See you next time.